So the title of this talk is Mastery Learning, Ability Development, and Individualized Education. It is really a two-part talk. For the first half or so, I am going to expound upon the principles of what most people know as Suzuki method, although in Japanese it is referred to as Saino Kyoiku, which translates alternatively as talent education or ability development. The second half of the talk, I'm going to discuss the way in which these principles of talent education can be applied to all areas of learning, and specifically in regards to one of my children and math, and the story of her and mathematics, and how it was pretty much a total disaster, and it was fully rescued by applying the correct principles. Now, some people know this about me, but I don't have a degree in English, nor do I have a degree in education. I guess that makes me particularly well qualified to travel the world and do teacher training in English composition, but my formal training is in music. So I spent the first 15 years of my adult life as a full-time violin, Suzuki violin, and Kindermusik teacher. And I had the tremendous opportunity to live in Japan from approximately 1982 to 1985 and study with Dr. Suzuki, Shinichi Suzuki, the founder of Suzuki Method Talent Education. And he was still quite young then, in his 80s. He lived to right around 100. And he was one of the truly great people that have lived on Earth in my lifetime. He's one of those people that if you just get close, you know you are in the presence of greatness. And I had the opportunity to have almost daily contact with him for the better part of 3 years. And I read everything that I could, and I believe that I kind of am a purist, which would translate in my mind as one of the best, to be humble. But kind of a purist when it comes to Suzuki method, and having had all that experience in Japan, where they do it a bit more seriously, a bit differently, a bit more, I would say, effectively than you might find in various places in the West here. And so I'm going to share with you my understanding of the 4 pillars of talent education, along with a few little stories of how that is meaningful and how I found it very significant in my life and teaching. So Suzuki method came into being, I guess, kind of as an observation that Suzuki made. He woke up one day, I suppose, at least this is the way the story goes. He looked around the world and noticed something very significant. All Japanese children speak Japanese. And they do it without going to school. They do it pretty much perfectly by the age of 6 or 7, and nobody fails, right? All Japanese children learn Japanese, and they learn it by the age of 6 or 7 better than anyone else in the world could do that. You or I could go live in Japan for 20 years, and we probably still would not speak as effortlessly and fluently and easily and naturally as a young child. How does this happen? That was his question. He thought, here we see kids learning to do arguably the hardest thing there is to learn, and they do it so easily. If we could figure out how they do this and apply those things to other areas of education, we should be able to get similarly excellent results. And that was how Suzuki method was born. So the first thing that Suzuki noted about Japanese children learning Japanese, and this of course would be true for any child in any culture, is that they don't go to school to learn this. They pretty much learn it before they even start school, and it's the hardest thing they're ever going to learn. Where do they learn it? At home. From whom? Their parents. When do they start learning it? From the time they're born, at the earliest possible age. Where do they live? In Japan, right? And what is the method by which they acquire this ability? So these are the 4 pillars we're going to address. We'll start with environment, because this, in a way, was one of the most radical ideas that Suzuki introduced into the world of music education. He said, okay, Japanese children born in Japan, they are constantly surrounded by Japanese. Auditory Japanese, visual Japanese, telepathic Japanese, kinesthetic Japanese, just a constant saturation. So if you wanted someone to learn something well, you would do well to create an environment in which they were surrounded by what you want them to learn. Now, his thing was music. He had actually begun the study of violin at an older age, in his early 20s, and then he had lived in Germany for several years to study with one of the great violin teachers in Germany. He ended up marrying a German woman, Waltraud, who came back to Japan and lived there with him for the rest of their lives. But living in Germany, he had a personal acquaintance of the difficulty of learning a foreign language as an adult to compare it with the ease of a child. And so he thought, okay, if we want to teach children music, we should be sure the music we want to teach them is in their environment. So that's the first principle here, the right environment. And to make this happen, he created recordings of the pieces of music that the children would learn to play. In the very, very beginning days, this was on reel-to-reel tapes. Some of you may have seen this in a museum, right? We had one when I was a kid, but they were on their way out. Then, of course, we got records. You know, those large black round things that look like CDs, only bigger and black? And then, of course, cassette tapes, and then CDs, and now MP3s, right? So the whole thing. But the idea was pretty radical. You're going to play for children recordings of the music that you want them to learn to play on an instrument? Isn't that cheating? That actually was the attitude of many music teachers in that day. That if you heard the piece of music before you figured out how to read it, that was cheating, and you weren't going to learn to read music well if you did that. Some people, even to this day, hold to this idea, but the proof is in the pudding, because you go to any major symphony in the world and all the top violinists were all Suzuki kids, 20, 30 years ago. So he created this repertoire of 10 books of pieces of music, classical violin music, and then he created the recordings, and he said, okay, before you even pick up a violin, start playing these recordings to young children, again and again, every day. And what happens? Well, they memorize the music. They start to know exactly what comes next. And then when you go to teach them to play the music, they don't have to learn the music. They already know the music. They just have to learn how to make their fingers do those things. So that's one huge advantage. The other thing we see is that having memorized the music auditorily serves as a control of error. So if you're playing along and you make an error, what you play is different than what it should be, your brain tells you, no, that's not right. But if you don't have it recorded, how would you know? And you could actually practice wrong things, wrong notes or wrong rhythms. And anyone who's played a musical instrument well knows it is way harder to undo something you learned incorrectly than to learn it correctly in the first place. So the recordings provided a model. The children had a high quality of performance to try and imitate. I want to sound like that. They had a memory of the piece of music that formed a control of error so that they would know if they did it correctly or not. And then there's also that joy of fulfillment in being able to do now something that you previously had heard being done. So this was, as I said, radical in the world at the time, but it was a huge, huge change in the ease in which you could teach children to play. Now, one of the problems that happened, mostly in the West, is that you would get children who could play what they could hear, but they didn't learn to read music, therefore they couldn't read well, and that was bad. And so people started to criticize Suzuki method, saying, oh, well, that's a method where kids never learn to read music. That's just not true at all. That's a teaching fault, not a fault of the method. In Japan, all the kids learn to read music, and they learn to read it well. What's different is we didn't make their playing dependent on their decoding skills. And if you're going to start with a child at a very young age, as Suzuki did, which is the next pillar I will mention, it's not reasonable to expect young children to read complex music and decode it. But all of my students started reading music at the same time they started playing the violin. But they would sing notes. And I didn't ever make their playing dependent upon their reading until many years later, when playing ability and decoding skills would merge and become more connected. But yes, you may bump into a student who could play Vivaldi concertos but can't read simple orchestra music, and you say, well, that's sad. But it's not a problem with the method, it's a problem with the teacher and the implementation and the lack, I would say, of a good understanding of how to do that. So that was the first pillar, was the right environment. So we would think about applying this in the teaching of anything, whether it's a foreign language or geography or math or whatever. The more you want a child to learn, the easier you want them to learn, the more you would saturate their environment with visual, auditory, tactile, kinesthetic experience of that thing, right? The second pillar would be the earliest age, and sometimes the earliest age goes before the right environment, so you can think about it either way, but Suzuki noted, rightly so, that young children can learn languages easier than older people, and that we now know kind of the science as to why that's true, and it has to do with the rate of brain growth during the first 6 and 12 years of life. We have reference to Maria Montessori and all of her explication of the absorbent mind and the power of the young child. And then anyone who's watched children realizes that they can imitate a language and memorize stuff to a very fine degree of nuance and difference, right? In most countries, you have one language, but you have different kind of ways that language is used. In Japan, it's maybe a little more different, although if you go to certain places, say in the South, you can meet people who have a pretty strong accent. In other places, it's not as strong. But then I'm sure you've all had the experience of hearing like a teenage child and mistaking it momentarily for the parent, right? Why? Because children will imitate their environment to such a refined degree. And we can't do that, right? When I learned to speak Japanese, it was very awkward Japanese. It was not sounding particularly like any area of Japan. I could stumble through and people would understand me if I tried hard and they were patient. And I could understand people if they would talk slowly and tried to help me a little bit. But if you were to compare, say, the northern part of the country with the southern part of the country, it would sound different to a Japanese person. I might not be able to imitate to that degree, but young children can. So Suzuki noted the younger children have this greater capacity for very nuanced level of imitation of language. And the younger, the better. So he said, well, okay, if that's true, why wouldn't we start teaching music to younger children? And it was a little convenient because his family happened to own a violin factory. So he was able to get a source of very small violins. Have you ever seen those things? like 1/16 size. They make them even smaller. They sound horrible, but they're cute as heck. And so you can get a violin that will fit the body of a 4-year-old and start teaching very young children, 4, 5, 6 years old, to play a musical instrument. Pianos don't shrink, but you can still teach young children how to play them. And Suzuki method has, by the way, since gone way beyond just violin and piano. And there's cello and flute and harp and guitar and, I don't know, maybe even bagpipes or saxophone, somebody. I mean, if you understand the principle, you can apply it to any instrument. And if you understand the principles well, you can apply them to learning anything. So Suzuki said, okay, let's start at this younger period. Now, this also was kind of in direct competition, or it was in direct contrast to the way that most people thought about music education. So back in that time period, 20s and 30s, that'd be the 1920s and 30s. The idea that most people had, especially in our country, was if your child shows a talent or aptitude, which you probably would start to see around 11, 12 years old, then and only then would you invest time and money in giving that child music lessons. You wouldn't want to waste time and money giving a child music lessons if they didn't have a talent for it. And that was the kind of universal mentality. And so you would wait until the child would show or not show talent. Suzuki said, no, talent can be educated. Talent is not inborn. Talent can be created or it can be neglected by various factors. And one of those factors, in addition to environment, is if you start at a young age, you get a higher aptitude. So he starts teaching all these little kids violin, and pretty soon he's teaching other people how to teach little kids violin. And then pretty soon, over a period of decades, there's people all around the world doing which a short 30 years ago was extremely rare, right? There were always the prodigies. There were, the rare kid who showed talent at such a young age. You figured out, oh, let's find someone to make a tiny little violin and we'll do this. But it was a rarity. But by the time he was halfway through his teaching career, there were thousands, dozens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of children all around the world playing violin at 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old and playing quite well. So the early period, that was the second. The third one was the right teacher. So you have the right environment, the right age or period, and the right teacher. Suzuki noticed that children learn their language from primarily their mother. In fact, Suzuki method was originally called the mother tongue method of education. And it was only after a while that then became talent education. And so Suzuki thought, well, if that's where kids learn the best from their mother, we've got to involve mothers in the process of teaching them music. So he started this idea of teaching the mother, or the parent, father too, teaching the mother how to teach the young child to play the violin. Again, revolutionary in the world of music education at that time. Because the way it kind of went, this was my mother's experience. She started playing the piano at 12 years old. She ended up being a piano and voice teacher. And her mother would drive her to the piano teacher's house. She would walk up the steps and go in, get a piano lesson while her mother waited in the car reading magazines. Then she would come back to the car and her mother would drive her home. And that was the total level of involvement, financial and logistical support. That was it. And then my mother at 12, 13, 14, 15 years old was responsible to practice and do everything the teacher said to improve. But if you're going to teach a young child, you almost have to get a mother involved because you can't really expect a 6-year-old to go to a music lesson and then come home and remember everything they're supposed to do, right? But it was formalized in a very delightful way. in that culture, in the Japanese culture. And the Japanese are very traditional in lots of ways. In fact, I believe to this day that in all schools, when the teacher walks into the room, all the students stand up. And then the students and the teacher will bow to each other and start the class, "Onegai shimasu," please help me, please teach me. And then at the end of the class, bell rings or whatever, everybody would stand up, and again, they bow to each other, "Domo arigatou gozaimasu," thank you very much. I think we could learn a lot in our schools from instituting such little rituals that are deeply embedded in the Asian tradition there. But so Suzuki got this going with the parent and the child, and I watched a lesson. I watched a first lesson taught by a Japanese Suzuki teacher. And this is exactly what happened. The teacher had the child and the parent stand across from each other, and the teacher said to the child, whatever their name is, Saito, "Meet your home teacher." Home teacher, meet your student. And then they would bow to each other, just like they would in a classroom, right? Or in a martial arts dojo or something, right? So this formalization of the relationship. And then the teacher, in the beginning, would spend most of the lesson teaching the mom what to do, and then using a small part of that time to demonstrate with the child. Here's what you go do at home, right? And then as the child grows, the ratio of time spent on the parent would decrease as the ratio of time spent with the student would increase, right? And most of the moms would either use the tiny little violin or, better, get a full-size violin and start learning how to do what the child was going to learn how to do. And so this was an absolute for me. When I came back from Japan and started teaching, this was non-optional. If you wanted me to teach your child to play the violin, you had to learn at least the beginning steps. Now, what happens, of course, is the child, depending on the age and speed, will at some point pass up the mother, at which point it's kind of depressing for the mom. And, she may or may not keep going. Most of them would quit. But you've accomplished that thing. But even at the higher level, parents are involved. I watched a lesson with a teenager, she's probably, 15, 16, 17, playing an insanely difficult piece of music, the Wieniawski Concerto. Insanely difficult. And the mother was still there at the lesson, taking notes on everything the teacher said, so that she could, remind and coach her daughter as she would practice at home as need might arise. So parental involvement is very, very common and universal. And this formality, it's very hard for us to create in our Western world. We're so much less formal. But I just want to give you a little picture of the national concert in Japan. So there's a big Coliseum-like place. It's called the Budokan. And big sporting events, the national judo championships and stuff would happen there. It holds many thousands of people, right? Dozens of thousands of people. And the national concert would generally start out with a very small number of children, maybe 10 teenagers, playing an insanely difficult piece of music, perfectly in unison with piano accompaniment. And then they would add in some more kids, and they would play a slightly less, but still incredibly difficult piece of music, maybe 20 or 30 of them, in perfect unison with piano accompaniment. And then they would add in some more kids, and now maybe they're going to play Book 10, the Mozart Concerto Book 10. And so now you've got, 50, 80 kids playing this piece of music in perfect unison. And then they would add in some more and play maybe a piece from Book 9. And they would keep adding kids and going down until by the end, there were 2,000 children on the floor of the Budokan playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and variations together. And they would just add kids and go down in complexity. And of course, there's far more than a couple thousand kids in the country playing music, so it's kind of a great honor to be selected to do this. And we, being students at the school, were a little bit involved in the logistics of helping make this all happen. But then, the most delightful thing at the end of the whole concert Dr. Suzuki would come out, and he would say in his microphone, you could hear it all over the place, he would say, "Every child can learn. It all depends on the teacher," in Japanese. And all of the 2,000 students on the floor would say, "Thank you, teacher." Then Suzuki would say, "Every child can learn. It all depends on the parent." And then all the children in unison would say, "Thank you, parents." And then he would say, "Every child can learn. It all depends on you." And all of the children would then say, "I will do my best." And this ritual, so powerful culturally. So these three pillars, you have the right environment, the right period, and the right teacher. These were radical in the world of music instruction in the first half of the 20th century. And then around the 60s, there were people who went to Japan, they'd heard about this, they came back and they started teaching Suzuki method. And I was one of the very first Suzuki kids in Los Angeles in 1964. When I was 4 years old, I started to play the violin. But it was a small group, and a lot of people were very skeptical. But I am, of course, tremendously blessed to have grown up playing the violin. But then we get to the fourth pillar, and this is the one that most applies, I think, to our conversation today, and that is the right method. The right method. Suzuki noticed that children learn a language differently than you or I might go about trying to learn a language. Catrice, do you happen to speak Korean?
No.
No, and I don't either. Let us pretend for a moment that Catrice and I both want to learn to speak Korean for some reason, and we don't really know anyone, so we're going to have to get some recordings and some books, and we're both professional, organized people, so we're going to set goals, and we're going to meet at Starbucks every Wednesday to practice our Korean together so we make progress. Accountability, you know. And so we say, okay, our first goal is to learn these 20 words in Korean, right? So we practice, we have little flashcards, we drill ourselves, we hear it, and then we come together at Starbucks, we test each other, and we think, yes, we've learned 20 words in Korean. This is great. Let's learn 20 more. But we don't have a chance to practice and use the first 20. So we learn 20 more words, we get together at Starbucks, we test each other. Yes, we've learned 40 words in Korean. Let's learn 20 more. But we don't have a chance to practice and use the first 40. And then we learn 20 more, and then we learn 20 more, but we don't practice and use. Well, we could continue this education for 20 years. At any given moment, how many words in Korean would we be able to use? About 20, right? And in a way, you know, that kind of reflects the way that we do a lot of education, right? We learn something with the intent to know it and then forget it. We've even institutionalized this in universities. Like, nobody even thinks I'm going to try and remember all this stuff. I'm just going to learn it so I can pass a test, so I can get a grade, so I can move on. Now, we only see the brilliance of this when we juxtapose it against the way a child learns a language. Okay, so you got a baby, right? It comes out of the chute and it starts making noise. And it makes noise for about a year or so. And then right around the time it stands up and starts to walk, this baby is likely to say his or her first word. Do you remember your first child's first word? It's so exciting. Mama. She said mama. Did you hear that? She said mama. You're so excited. And then this child uses this word continuously, incessantly, relentlessly for everything she wants until you start to wonder, is this kid ever going to get another word? But then one day it happens. You hear the second decipherable word. In my case, I hoped it would be dada, but no, it was Coco, the dog who lived next door. Anyway, then this child uses these two words continuously and incessantly and for everything they want until you may think, is this child language delayed? But then you hear it, the third word, and they use these three words continuously, incessantly for everything they want. And then one day you hear it, the fourth word, and then pretty soon the fifth, pretty soon the sixth. And then by the age of 2 or 3, these words are coming so fast, you can't even log them into a book. But here's what's interesting. The child never stops using all of the words that they have learned up to that point. So there's this tremendous power in cumulative growth, right? And they have total mastery of the words that they have learned. They never stop using them. They get easier and easier. They start putting them into new combinations and permutations based on other environmental influences. And by the age of 6 or 7, this child speaks a language effortlessly, fluently, easily. And from then on, it's just up sophistication. But the core ability has been developed. So Suzuki said, well, okay, if this is the way children learn language, what we should do is set up a system where they learn something, but they don't just forget it, they keep doing it while they learn the next thing. And then they keep doing it while they learn the next thing. They keep doing that. So he set up his books of repertoire, and every child, regardless of age or experience, would start with Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star variations and theme. And they would learn each variation and then the theme, and they would play all the variations and the theme. And once they had that, then they would start in on Lightly Row. But they wouldn't stop playing Twinkle variations and theme. They would still play that every day. Even though they could, they would play it so that it would become easier, a little bit better, smoother, faster, whatever. Once they've got Lightly Row pretty much down, they would play Twinkle variations and theme and Lightly Row while they go for Song of the Wind. And Song of the Wind has a little tricky thing that's new. You've never done it before, so you learn the little tricky new thing first. Then you learn the whole piece. And then you're playing, Twinkle variations and Lightly Row and Song of the Wind, and you're learning Go Talent Roadie. And then once you got Go Talent Roadie under your belt, you play all of that while you go for O Come Little Children. And once you got that under your belt, you go for all that while you get into perpetual motion, right? And so a properly trained Suzuki student would be able to play every piece they have ever learned from memory easily and probably without error. And that is a high level of ability. But again, this was radical in the world. My mother's time period, right? Kid goes to grandma's house. Hey, play something for me. I can't. Well, I've been paying you for piano lessons for 6 years. Yes, well, the piece that I learned and played on the recital last month, I forgot. And the piece I'm working on right now, I don't know yet. Right? Fluency, 0. So this idea of retained mastery of repertoire. So the way I did it was similar to the way most of the Suzuki teachers in Japan did it. All of my students had to play every piece they had ever learned every day until the end of book 1. At the end of book 1, then the book 1 pieces would go on the every other piece, every other day schedule. So to do that would take 17.5 minutes. Then you would go on the every other piece every other day while you were going into book 2, and you would play every piece in book 2 every day until you did book 2 graduation. And that meant, by the way, standing up in front of all the audience and playing the entire, 17 pieces or whatever's in the book from memory with accompaniment for an audience. Get your graduation certificate, okay. Then book 1 would go to every third piece every third day. Book 2 would go to every other piece every other day. And book 3 was on the every piece every day. And at this point, you start to run out of time. Once you run out of time, you get yourself a nice little magic hat or bowl or goldfish bowl or whatever. And you put all the pieces you know on a little piece of paper, throw them all in the bowl, pick out as many as you have time for. When they're all out, you put them all back in. So that you're constantly having an opportunity to play what you know and make it easier and better. The very best teacher I ever saw in this country, and I went to the city where she lived just to watch her teach for 2 days. And I just watched her teach for 2 days. And she had all of the students realizing that there's a book 1 piece, lightly row, second piece, book 1. And there's a book 1 ability to play lightly row. And then there's a book 3 version of lightly row. And then there's a book 7 way in which a student would play a book 1 piece. That the quality, the ease, the mastery, the nuance was constantly improving. And so this is really the way that children learn language, is they constantly use and constantly gain more mastery at what they already know. So this is ability, and this is why it's called ability development. And I always wondered what would be the ratio. I know for a fact that if you were to spend 90% of your time learning a new piece and 10% of your time playing pieces you already knew, you would not learn new pieces as quickly as if you spent like half your time playing the pieces you already knew and half your time learning new pieces. You'd actually spend less time on new pieces, but you would learn them faster because you're strengthening and expanding your database of previously existing musical patterns. And any new pattern, whether it's in language or music or art or anything, is actually a combination and permutation of previously existing patterns. But I don't know where the sweet spot is. 50-50, I'm sure, beats 90-10. But what if it was 90-10 the other way, right? Could you still learn new pieces faster because you had that mastery? So I finally settled in the 60-40, 70-30 zone. But people in the West have a much lower tolerance for repetition. And so I think Suzuki method had to be born in the East, simply because of the cultural orientation towards repetition. In fact, there's a saying in Japanese, everybody knows it, it's like a proverbial saying. 10,000 times, and then begins understanding. Then begins understanding. We have nothing like that. What do we say? Try again, 3rd time's a charm? Like, if you don't get it after 3, just give up, We do not have the tolerance, but we do see people in music and art, and, music, art, and probably especially sports is in this category, or dance. Like, you have to do it so many times that you can not think about it, and then you can actually start to know what you're doing. That feeling. And we just don't do that well in the West. Okay. So, I was a Suzuki teacher trying to apply these methods as best as I could. And then my children started coming along. And I have 7 children. And at a certain point, we got to the middle child of the batch that were at home. And she hit 6 years old. Now, when a child hits 6 years old and you're homeschooling, you suddenly realize, oh no, this child is 6 years old. And it's time now to do school with this child. I mean, up until then, they just wander around, keep them alive, they trickle down, you don't worry. But oh no, 6 years old. So, the way you start doing school with a 6-year-old at home is you get a little pile of books with a 1 on the cover, right? And so you get a little pile of books with a 1 on the cover. And so we gave this particular child a math book with a 1 on the cover. Now, if you haven't recently seen a math book with a 1 on the cover, you open it up, and for most of the book, you're just counting frogs, right? So you've got 3 frogs and 4 frogs, and then you count them, and then you end up with 3 plus 4 equals 7. And you do that for a while until you've got too many frogs to count on your fingers. You've got 6 frogs plus 7 frogs. But they're still frogs, and all you have to do is count them. And so you get that, and you put 13, okay. And then after a while, you start killing your frogs. All right, so now you've got, 8 frogs, and you cross off 4 frogs, and you've got 4 left, and you're thinking, okay, 8 minus 4 is 4, and then you get into a harder zone where you've got 13 frogs and you kill 7 of them. But they're still frogs, and all you have to do is count them, and you put the 6. And then toward the end of the book, the frogs start to disappear, and all you're left with is these numbers. But you still have fingers. which aren't as easy as frogs because you run out of fingers, but nevertheless, you can still do it. So by the end of the year, if you had asked this particular child, what's 6 plus 7? She would have done this. "13?" With about that much speed and about that much confidence. Okay, now, in this country, we do something that is not particularly beneficial to children, but it does keep people in the career of teaching. And that's called summer. Summer is not particularly beneficial to children academically, but without summer, no one in their right mind would be a teacher. Now, the problem with summer is it's hot in most places. So evaporation occurs. Now, the textbook publishers know this. So at the beginning of the next year's textbook, they put the same kind of problems you had at the end of the previous year's textbook to remind you of all those things that evaporated. So, okay, you get this little honeymoon period. Okay, nothing particularly new. You still can manipulate your fingers, check your toes too. You're counting them and biting off the fingers, and you're done with that in a few weeks. And now there's a new concept. And in the grade 2 book, it very often involves having way more frogs than you can possibly count on your fingers and toes, and no frogs, invisible frogs. And so now you have to learn fancy stuff like carrying, right? And so now you have 27 frogs plus 46 frogs, only there's no frogs. So now you have to do like 3 math problems in one. 6 plus 7, figure that out, put it, carry it, add that, and there's your number, right? And then you keep going with that for a while, but it's tedious because you got 2 or 3 problems for every one problem, and you're not sure, and you're getting more wrong because you don't have enough fingers to figure it out. And then you have to start subtracting, and you get these ugly problems like 24 minus 17. Or worse, 86 minus 29. Now you have to borrow. And that adds a complexity. It adds a variable of uncertainty. You're more likely to get incorrect answers. And you start to dislike this thing because it's tedious. Well, okay, so you slog through this grade 2 math book, and by the end of the year, if you had asked this particular child of mine, what's 6 plus 7, she would have said, 13, with about that much speed and about that much confidence. Summer, evaporation. By merit of being a year older, you must get a book with the next number on the cover. You must. So now, being 8 years old, you have to have a book with a 3 on the cover. And very quickly, your honeymoon period wears out. It wasn't all that fun because you really didn't know that stuff very well, enough to have forgotten it, to relearn it. And so now you're really burdened by this idea of carrying and borrowing, but then quickly you move into the evil world of multiplication. Now you not only have to know what 6 plus 7 is, you have to know what 6 times 7 is. But fortunately, there are tools. A big chart. And the chart has 1 through 12 in the top and 1 through 12 in the side. And you get a problem like 4 times 6, and you just look 4 and 6, and you see, haha, 24. And 6 times 7, 6 times 7, aha, 42. That's really awful if you're dyslexic, but that's a different topic, right? So you use your chart and you do multiplication for a while, and that's not so bad. But then, division. Now you have the problem of 42 divided by 6. So you stare at your chart and you look for a 42. You find the 42, and you go up, and you're like, aha, 7, 6. 42 divided by 7, 6. But it's really nasty if you have a problem like 24 divided by 8, because you look for the 24, and there's a lot of them. Which one is the one you want? It's got to be the one that is in the 8 column, right? And this is now tedious and time-consuming. And then by the end of that book with a 3 on the cover, you get really nasty stuff, like 26 times 7. Now you definitely have 3 problems, all of which you cannot do easily. In every one problem, it's slow, it's tedious, you're more likely to get something wrong, and now you start to say things like, I hate math, which is poison to a mother's heart. And then summer, evaporation. New year, by merit of being a year older, not because you mastered the previous content, but because you are a year older, you must get a book with a 4 on the cover, and very quickly the honeymoon period is no honeymoon. It's as bad as it was or worse, and now you move into the deep and dark pit of fractions. Now, fractions is where math starts to become impossible. If you do not know your math facts, you cannot possibly do fractions. So now there's tears. Now there's crying. Now there's, I hate math. I'm so stupid and I can't do it. And if you ask this child at any moment in time, what is 6 plus 7? She would have said 13, with about that much speed and about that much confidence. Only that just doesn't fly. If you ask her what 6 times 7 was, she'd be like, where's my chart? And if you asked her to multiply or add fractions, it was so far from her capacity to think mathematically, she just couldn't do it. So now the solution is change curriculum. That's always the solution. If you're not doing well, get a different book. So in our case, we switched to a curriculum that had 2 numbers on the cover. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Well, that's not helping, and there's tears, and it's worse. And you get kind of to the end of that year, and you think, you know, let's just call it now. You know, it's almost the end of the school year. I mean, it is May 1st. And we've been at this for such a long time, and everybody's so miserable. Maybe if we just take a break and she gets a little older, everything will be easier. So now you've lengthened the period of evaporation. Actually, there was very little to evaporate at all. And now it's just bone-dry desert. And then in the fall, by merit of being 1 year older, you must get a book with new numbers on the cover, and now it is total meltdown. Complete incapacity to do even the first problem in the book independently. Poor mom, who actually has a degree in elementary education and is supposed to be able to teach math K through 8, has no clue. We're having the evil conversation. It happens at night, in bed, when you would rather be doing something else. And it usually goes like this. I'm totally failing her. We need to look for a good school. And I have to be the voice of sanity. Do you think a teacher in a school could solve this problem? I mean, even the best teacher in the best school couldn't fix this. Now, here's what the problem was. I saw it happen. I knew exactly what was happening, but it was her domain. She's the elementary ed. She's the homeschooling. I'm busy. I'm building a business. I'm working, trying to do all sorts of stuff. I knew what was happening, but I did not intercede until total crisis had occurred. Now, I knew what to do. I knew exactly what to do, but I wasn't sure how to do it. Of course, what needs to be done? She needs to go back, essentially, and learn her addition facts and multiplication facts. Nothing will be possible if we don't do that. But how do you do that, right? Here we have a hormone zapped out, almost 12-year-old child. You can't give them a book with a 1 on the cover. You have to take an alternative route. Now, I happen to know about Kumon. Now, this is not an advertisement for Kumon, okay? This is not in any way. But I happen to know about it because when I was in Japan, one of my friends there was a girl whose parents were Japanese, but she grew up in the States, and she was perfectly bilingual, could read and write English and Japanese very, very well. She's 17 years old. And so she actually did a lot of translation for Suzuki and the organization. And one of the things that she translated into English was an interview between Dr. Shinichi Suzuki and Dr. Toru Kumon, the inventor of the Kumon math system. And they had a conversation. This was recorded, transcribed, and translated, and I read the English version of it. And that's how I first heard about Kumon back in, would have been like 84, 85. And of course, the interesting thing was mastery, right? The Kumon system is based on the idea that you do not go to the next level of complexity until you have speed and accuracy at the level of complexity where you need to be in order to be successful at the next level. You will not be successful with subtraction unless you have speed and accuracy and know your math fact. You will not have success with decimals unless you have speed and accuracy with fractions, right? So we took her to the Kumon Center where we were living at the time. And she came home, and I've never seen a more distressed child in my life because they gave her packets, no books, no numbers on the cover, packets. And every problem in every one of these packets that she was supposed to do every day was 8 plus 1, 1 plus 7, 6 plus 1, 1 plus 4. Like the whole thing was plus 1. And she was just so distraught. She's like, this is like baby math, and I'm the stupidest girl in the whole world. Stop. You can do this. We know you can do this. So just do it and just trust the system. Trust me, trust the system. We can't do that. We're going to do this. Okay, so she did it, went back, got new packets. These packets had 8 plus 1, 2 plus 6, 1 plus 5, 2 plus 7, right? The whole thing was 1s and 2s. But she did it. She went back, and she got plus 3s and 4s, and pretty soon she's getting 6 plus 7, and she's getting these things, and the repetition and the mastery is such that she's starting to know math facts. And then, okay, you get into multiplication. Flashcards, that's the way my parents taught me, right? They didn't rely on the school. They didn't rely on a textbook. Flashcards is how you learn multiplication efficiently. High repetition. And then practice on paper. Verbal practice, auditory practice. So anyway, I know how to do this. So I'm like, okay, we're going to do flashcards. So she gets the multiplication facts, and then she gets into division, and that's going pretty well, because now you can see a 42 and go, ha, I know 42, it's 6, 7, right? And find it in your brain, not on the wall. And then we got into double digit, and that's like doing 2 or 3 problems in one problem, but now it's pretty fast. And one really interesting difference between the way most of us learn math in American schools and the way most Japanese people learn math. Our teachers always said, show all your work, right? The Japanese teacher, only write down what you have to. Do everything that you can in your brain, in your mind. Which do you think promotes better mathematical thinking? Faster mathematical thinking. Multi-step conglomeration of mathematical processes, right? I don't know why teachers do this. I think it's possible because they want you to prove that you didn't cheat by just copying someone else's answers. Or this idea of, well, I want to know where you broke down in your process. Well, okay, you could do that, but you could also do it the other way and figure that out. So we hit this point where we had been doing the same thing. I think it was long division. And it had been months of the same problems. Again and again and again. And I thought, okay, can we just move on here? You know, because she's getting old. She's almost 14. We're still doing long division. So I went to the teacher, Japanese woman. I said, Kyoko, I think that maybe she's been doing this problem for a long time, and she understands it, and maybe it's time to move on. And she said, no, I think she needs a little bit more speed and accuracy. A little bit more speed and accuracy. Then she'll be success. Do not argue with a Japanese math teacher. But that's what I was paying for. I was paying for the discipline of mastery. Okay, fast forward another year. She's now almost 15, and she can add, subtract, multiply, divide, positive, negative, decimals, and fractions, all in one equation, faster than I can. Now, she's still not where other kids in school might be at 14 and a half, 15. But man, has she learned to think mathematically. And I used to do some of the problems just to see, could I keep up? But I didn't do the full program. So I didn't have the same level of speed. But she had it. And then they get into algebra, and then I decided to teach geometry because they don't do geometry. And I thought, okay, this is a high school kid. She's got to get some geometry somewhere. So I used the Math You See geometry, and I watched Steve Demmy's videos to remember a little bit of geometry. So I taught her and a few other kids geometry class. And meanwhile, she's moving along Algebra 2 level stuff, and she's able to solve these problems by writing down a whole lot less stuff than I would write down to solve the problem. And then finally, she's kind of grown up, and she believes that she has to do trigonometry to get the ACT score she wants to get into the college she wants to get into. I don't know trigonometry, so okay. So she is old enough to drive herself to the community college at 17, takes a trig class, does it all herself, still doing the Kumon stuff, which is like now very as advanced as they get. And then she does it. She takes her ACT, gets her score, gets into the college she wants. 3 years into school. Everyone in this college, is a small liberal arts school, everyone has to take calculus. You can't get your degree from this school without taking calculus. I never took calculus, so I wouldn't have a clue where to begin. I know one word, function. That's my calculus knowledge right there. Anyway, so 3 years in, she does this. She comes home for the summer. And she says, okay, Mom, Dad, I know that I complained a lot about math, and I complained a lot about the Kumon stuff, but I'm really glad you did that, because if you hadn't, I wouldn't be able to graduate from this school. So, thank you. Which is what you're always waiting for your children to say when they're old enough to experience gratitude for the suffering you inflicted. This particular child is now in her 3rd year of medical school. And while I would have voted her at the age of 12 least likely to ever want to do anything academically rigorous in her life, I believe the math part of it and other parts of it, it gave her the confidence that she could. If she could learn that, she could learn anything. And part of that kind of, growing up, I'm not smart, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer around here, that kind of subconscious feeling. She's had this desire to kind of, I think, disprove that. Say, no, I can. So, now, I'm not saying this that you should all rush out and enroll in Kumon. That's not the point of the story. The point of this story is for you to think, okay, where may I have a child who is been pushed beyond a level of mastery? Pushed beyond a point where there's speed and accuracy and confidence. And this can happen in a language thing like grammar or writing. It can happen very easily in a foreign language thing because that's cumulative, right? It can happen in an art like music, right? And you've got a kid who just does the next piece and then they just crash. They can't do anything more challenging than that because they don't have the foundation of mastery. So the principle really is easy plus one, which is part of our tagline, our byline. This is the way I teach people to teach style techniques to kids in writing. You have a checklist of things to do, and you only put on that checklist what is easy, plus maybe one new thing. And you do just that until that's easy. And when that's easy, then perhaps you add another thing, and you do just that until that's easy. And that's the way you should teach everything. Now, the problem with textbooks and workbooks is that they don't always work, right? Workbook, it's an oxymoron. It does no work whatsoever. It just exists. And the problem, and I see this biggest in things like math and spelling, which are cumulative and do have a predetermined pace, right? You buy a math workbook or a spelling workbook, it's going to go on at its happy little merry pace, completely oblivious to the child. The child may be bored to death because they didn't need that number of repetitions, or more likely the child is lost, frustrated, and starting to hate it because it didn't give enough repetition for mastery. And all kids can need different levels of repetition. That's why education, particularly in these cumulative subject skill things, really does need to be individualized. In the correct way of teaching math in a classroom, everybody would be at exactly where they need to be. But when you take a group of children and say, we're going to make this child go through this stuff at this pace, and everybody's going to do it according to the same speed in the same way, you will inevitably fail some of these children, and you will inevitably bore some of the children, who will then also hate it because they're bored. So anything you buy, any book, textbook, workbook, anything you buy, it's only as good as you are. And you have to be in charge of it, not having it be in charge of you. And if you're going through and you hit a point, whether it's grammar or spelling or math or whatever, and it isn't at the easy plus one spot, it's in the not easy plus 10, and you're just floundering, what do you have to do? You got to stop. And it doesn't matter the age of the kid and what number should be on their cover. I really like the way Matthew C. organized their textbooks. No numbers on the cover. Greek letters. And nobody even knows the order of Greek letters, right? Hey, I'm in Delta. What does that mean? No clue. But that's where I am, right? And so that's kind of helpful. But this idea, if you need to stop here and do more repetition, just like this, create your own practice stuff, or go to a website that creates practice stuff, right? And master it before you move on. And then you get this momentum of mastery plus one, mastery plus one, mastery plus one equals success. So that's the story of my middle child and math. And I hope this understanding of the pillars of talent education, environment, early period, right teacher, but most of all, application of the right methodology will help you help your kids be successful in everything that you're trying to help them learn. Thank you very much.